They say history is written by the victors, but what if it's protected by the dead? Beneath the marble silence of Westminster Abbey lies a secret England swore never to reveal. March 24th, 1603. A woman gasps her final breath, her crown slipping from trembling hands. To the world, she was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen who turned a bankrupt island into an empire. But behind the golden glory was something else, something grotesque. For centuries, England told us, Elizabeth Tudor never married because she chose duty over desire. They lied. What really lived beneath the white mask she wore was not purity, but decay. Her body was rotting while she still breathed, poisoned by the very image that made her immortal. Tonight we open the coffin sealed for 600 years and uncover the sickening reason the Virgin Queen could never be a wife or a mother. By the final winter of her life, Richmond Palace had turned into a mausoleum draped in silk. The scent of death lingered in its corridors long before the heralds declared a royal illness. It was not the clean odor of disease or the faint sweetness of medicinal herbs, but a heavy, suffocating stench that crept beneath every doorway. Servants scrubbed the marble floors with lavender water until their hands blistered. Priests swung censers of frankincense until their eyes burned from the smoke. Yet nothing could drive out that dreadful perfume of rot. Behind the closed doors of the Queen's chamber, the most powerful woman in Europe sat surrounded by darkness. Her body, once a symbol of divine strength, had become a battlefield between vanity, decay, and silence. Elizabeth Tudor no longer resembled the radiant monarch whose portraits had once filled courts from Madrid to Moscow. She had shrunk into herself, propped upright by embroidered cushions because her legs could no longer bear her weight. The famous red hair was now a brittle wig that slipped from her scalp if she turned too quickly. Her white face, once luminous under candlelight, was a fragile mask of lead and vinegar, cracking like ancient plaster whenever she tried to speak. Beneath that powdered armor, her flesh was splitting, blistered, and corroded by the very cosmetics that had defined her majesty. Yet no one dared look too closely. Touching a queen's skin without command was treason, to mention the odor was blasphemy. So they smiled and curtsied and whispered their prayers while the Virgin Queen slowly rotted alive. Outside her chambers, the court pretended that nothing was wrong. Ambassadors wrote reports describing her strength, her composure, her wit, because England could not afford weakness. The Spanish had been watching for decades, waiting for the moment the empire cracked from within. And so every cough was disguised as laughter, every fainting spell as a sign of fasting or prayer. The royal physicians were summoned daily but dared not diagnose what they could plainly smell. Their tools stayed clean, their eyes fixed on the ground. In the presence of a monarch, illness itself became treason. Those who did serve closest to her. Her ladies of the bedchamber carried the true horror in silence. They changed her linens twice a day, hiding the stains of blood and the yellow residue that soaked through even the thickest fabric. They fanned her through the night to keep the air moving, to mask the odor that clung to her gowns. They heard her mutter to shadows, calling for her father, Henry, long dead, or for a mother she had never known. Sometimes she would laugh softly, as if sharing a secret with the empty chair beside her. At other moments, she screamed that men in dark robes were crawling through the walls. The royal physicians called it fever. Her ladies called it haunting. As the weeks dragged on, even her counselors began to fear entering the room. The smell followed them down the corridors, through the courtyards, into the chapel. Rumors spread among the servants that something unnatural was happening to the queen, that her body was rebelling against years of vanity, that the spirit of Anne Boleyn had come to claim her daughter. The priests performed masses. The alchemists mixed new potions. Nothing changed. Elizabeth refused to lie down, refusing even the comfort of her bed. For hours, she sat motionless in her chair, eyes wide open, whispering verses of scripture under her breath, as if bargaining with a god she no longer trusted. When death finally approached, it did so not as a sudden blow, but as a slow surrender. Her pulse weakened, her words dissolved into murmurs. Yet still she resisted rest, clinging to the last illusion of control. By the time dawn broke over Richmond, the courtiers had already begun rewriting history. Orders were given to cleanse the chamber, to wash away every trace of sickness, to perfume the air before the messengers carried the news to London. The Virgin Queen was declared serene, peaceful, divine. But the truth was that England's greatest monarch had died surrounded not by glory, but by the unbearable smell of her own disintegration. A stench so potent that even 6 centuries later it seems to drift through the walls of Westminster Abbey, guarding the secret she took to her grave. To understand the horror of Elizabeth's final days, you have to travel back to where her nightmares began, a cold May morning in 1536, when a child not yet 3 years old lost everything she would ever love. The palace was hushed that day, its servants pretending not to hear the distant roar of the crowd. Beyond the gardens, on the scaffold at the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn, the woman who had torn England from the Pope's grasp, knelt before a French executioner. They did not let Elizabeth watch, but they could not keep the sound from her. First came the murmurs, then the dull thud, then silence so deep it seemed to swallow the air. Her mother's head had rolled into history, and with it any illusion that love or loyalty could protect a woman in the House of Tudor. From that moment, Elizabeth's life became a long lesson in disguise. She grew up in a court where affection was currency and fear was survival. The corridors of Henry VIII's palaces were not halls of splendor, but arenas of bloodless combat. Every smile hid a blade, every favor could turn to execution overnight. Wives came and went like seasons. Courtiers flattered until they were accused, then vanished into the Tower to await the axe. Elizabeth learned to read not just books but people, the twitch of a nobleman's lip, the tremor in a servant's voice, the temperature of her father's temper. She mastered silence before speech, obedience before trust. Weakness was a death sentence, dependence was suicide. The little girl who once wept for her mother hardened into a mirror, reflecting only what others needed to see. When her father stripped her of her royal title and branded her a bastard, she bowed gracefully and thanked him for his mercy. When he married again and again, parading new stepmothers as queens, she smiled and curtsied as if the ghosts of the past were not whispering behind her. The courtiers thought her harmless, a clever little girl who spoke Latin and danced politely. But inside, she was storing every insult, memorizing every betrayal. By the time her brother Edward ascended the throne, Elizabeth had turned her mind into a fortress. While fanatics set London aflame over religion, she studied scripture in both tongues, Catholic and Protestant, speaking whichever god her ruler demanded. When Mary, her elder sister, inherited the crown and began burning Protestants alive, Elizabeth shifted again, lighting candles to the Virgin Mary and crossing herself at Mass. She didn't believe in either faith, she believed in survival. But survival in Tudor England came with its own price. In 1554, when Mary's paranoia reached its fevered height, Elizabeth was dragged from her country estate and locked in the Tower, the same stone tomb that had swallowed her mother. The world she had known was reduced to 4 damp walls and the sound of dripping water. Each sunrise might have been her last. The guards would arrive without warning, their footsteps echoing through the corridor, and she would rise to meet them, never knowing whether they came to question or to kill. 2 months she endured that purgatory, interrogations disguised as conversations, priests urging her to confess to conspiracies she had never joined, courtiers hinting that a single signature could buy her freedom if she would only beg forgiveness. But she never broke. She spoke carefully, slowly, answering just enough to sound cooperative, but never enough to incriminate herself. Every pause, every tear, every tremor of her hand was a calculated performance. The Tower did not crush her, it refined her. When Elizabeth walked out of those gates, she was no longer the frightened daughter of Anne Boleyn. She was a creature forged by confinement, steel wrapped in silk. She had learned the most important rule of all: power comes not from love or birthright, but from control over one's words, one's body, one's image, and one's secrets. It was the lesson that would define her reign, imprison her heart, and in the end, destroy her flesh. The Virgin Queen was not born of purity, but of terror, shaped by a world that taught her to hide everything human behind a crown of gold and a smile carved from ice. When Mary Tudor's frail heart stopped in 1558, the bells of London did not ring in mourning. They trembled with relief. And in that uneasy silence, a 25-year-old woman, pale from years of suspicion and confinement, was crowned queen of a kingdom on the brink of ruin. The roads were flooded with mud, the treasury was empty, and the very idea of a female ruler was treated like a dangerous experiment. Yet as Elizabeth Tudor rode through the cheering crowds in her robe of cloth of gold, she looked like redemption made flesh. To the people, she was hope; to the nobles, she was a temporary inconvenience; to herself, she was already calculating the cost of wearing a crown that could as easily become a noose. Because Elizabeth understood something no one else did, power was never granted, only borrowed, and every debt demanded payment in blood or loneliness. Her first months on the throne were a battle fought not with swords but with smiles. The council demanded that she marry. Parliament whispered that the realm needed a male heir before chaos returned. Europe's ambassadors queued outside her chamber doors with portraits of princes, each painted to disguise age, arrogance, or disease. She entertained them all. Spain's grim Philip, Austria's humorless Archduke Charles, Sweden's lovesick Eric, France's charming Duke of Anjou, and dismissed them all with laughter. To the world it looked like indecision. To Elizabeth it was strategy. A married queen would become a pawn of her husband's empire. A virgin monarch could flirt with every alliance, yet belong to none. By dangling herself as the ultimate prize, she kept Europe guessing and England independent. Every promise of affection was a weapon, every coy glance a diplomatic treaty written in perfume instead of ink. But that performance required more than wit; it demanded perfection. She could never falter, never age, never bleed, never be seen as flesh and blood. The crown she wore was forged from expectation, and each jewel in it pressed deeper into her skull. Yet beneath the glittering facade lay something far more fragile than statecraft. Behind the rehearsed laughter and the dazzling gowns, Elizabeth carried a body that refused to obey the myths built around it. Her health, never strong, began to falter under the strain of ceremony and fear. The headaches grew sharper, her stomach rebelled against food, her limbs stiffened until rising from a chair required her lady's hidden strength. Still, she refused to rest. The legend of Gloriana could not limp, could not sweat, could not tremble. Her physicians recorded fevers that lasted for days, attacks of faintness that left her unable to stand, mysterious pains that moved through her abdomen like coiled fire. They whispered of imbalance, of humors corrupted, of organs that did not fit the pattern of womanhood, but their words ended in silence the moment they met her eyes. You did not dissect a miracle, you preserved it. Among those who served her closest, the truth began to circulate in terrified fragments. There were nights when the queen screamed for breath, clutching at her chest until the makeup cracked on her face. Mornings when she emerged radiant, as if nothing had happened, her skin powdered so thickly that the sores beneath could not be seen. The ladies learned to keep basins nearby for the sudden nosebleeds, to burn incense strong enough to choke the scent of sickness. Elizabeth endured it all without complaint, convinced that showing pain would invite ruin. She had outlived too many executions to surrender now to mortality. If her body was betraying her, then she would simply rule by sheer willpower, bending reality to the image she had created. The irony was cruel. In saving her kingdom from dependence on men, she had chained herself to an illusion even more merciless. She became both monarch and prisoner, trapped in a cycle of appearances that demanded she be less human with every passing year. The courtiers saw the radiance, the poets wrote of divine beauty, but behind the silks was a woman bound tighter than any corset could manage, her lungs compressed by fear, her heart clenched around a secret she could never confess. The Virgin Queen was not untouchable because she was holy, she was untouchable because she was breaking apart. And as Europe bowed before her legend, Elizabeth Tudor began the slow, deliberate descent from glory into suffering, her crown no longer a symbol of triumph, but a thorned halo that pierced her flesh every time she smiled. Every morning, long before the first petition reached the council chamber, Elizabeth's private war began in front of a mirror. Her ladies called it the ritual of becoming, though none of them dared admit what it truly was. A slow poisoning performed in the name of beauty, loyalty, and survival. The table before her glittered, not with jewels, but with instruments of death disguised as devotion, small jars of white paste, bowls of vinegar, brushes of boar bristle, and silver pots of rouge the color of dried blood. They called it Venetian ceruse, the finest cosmetic in Europe, a mark of refinement and royal purity. No one dared whisper its secret ingredient: white lead mixed with vinegar and, for extra brilliance, a trace of arsenic. It was the crown she wore upon her skin. The thick paste blurred every imperfection, covered every sore, erased the decades of exhaustion from her face, and gave her that ghostly radiance that painters called divine. But as the years turned into decades, that divine glow became her curse. Lead does not rest on the surface, it seeps through the skin like guilt. It enters the bloodstream, the bones, the brain. Slowly, invisibly, it corrodes the organs it touches. The physicians of her court never spoke of it directly, but they watched as her temper shortened, her hands trembled, her hair thinned and fell, her teeth blackened one by one until she could barely chew. She blamed the sweets, the endless march of age, the strain of rule. None dared contradict her. The sickness of her body became the sickness of her kingdom, a decay hidden beneath layers of ceremony and perfume. Her ladies tried to help by grinding fresh herbs, rosemary and lavender, to mask the smell, but it was futile. The lead was in her very pores. They washed her linens daily, burned sage at the windows, and still the air in her chamber turned heavy and metallic, as if even the walls were beginning to rot. By the time she reached her 50s, the mask had fused with the flesh beneath it. Removing it meant tearing away strips of skin. Some nights her attendants found her at her mirror, scraping desperately at her face, whispering prayers, watching in horror as blood welled through the cracks. They begged her to stop, but she would not. The Virgin Queen could not appear anything less than immortal. To be seen as mortal was to invite rebellion, to tell her enemies that God had abandoned her. And so she endured. Each morning the paste returned, thicker, heavier, harder. When the sores opened, they filled them with more paint. When the blackened flesh began to show, they dusted it with pearl powder and sealed it under another layer of poison. In portraits from her final decade, her skin shines with an unnatural perfection, not a face but a mask of alchemy. The toll on her mind was as relentless as the one on her body. Chronic exposure to lead brings not only pain but madness. Headaches that split the skull, visions, paranoia, mood swings, memory loss. Her courtiers recorded her sudden rages, the way she could go from laughter to screaming in the span of a heartbeat. Ministers cowered as slippers and jewels flew across the room. Ambassadors whispered of strange absences in conversation, moments when her gaze would drift past them into nothing. At night she paced her chambers until dawn, muttering to herself, refusing to sleep, terrified of closing her eyes. She drove her attendants to exhaustion, forcing them to keep vigil with her as she walked in endless circles, the hem of her gown brushing against the marble like a shroud. They called it insomnia. It was more than that. It was the slow unraveling of a mind poisoned by its own reflection. But Elizabeth could not stop. Every layer of makeup was not vanity, it was armor. Her face had become the battlefield upon which the illusion of her reign depended. To appear pale was to appear pure. To appear ageless was to appear divine. The courtiers and the ambassadors did not want a woman. They wanted an icon, something between saint and statue. So she gave them one. The real woman. The one who wept, who coughed blood into her handkerchief, who fainted behind the curtain, had ceased to exist. What remained was a hollow goddess painted in lead. The Virgin Queen had survived the knives of politics and the fires of faith, only to be destroyed by the mirror that reflected her own legend. And behind that mirror, somewhere in the poisoned silence of her chambers, the last fragments of Elizabeth Tudor's humanity crumbled to dust. By the closing years of her reign, the woman who had once terrified kings had become a ghost haunting her own legend. The courtiers still bowed, the painters still flattered, the poets still called her Gloriana, but the illusion had begun to crack. Behind the jeweled gowns and towering wigs, Elizabeth Tudor was collapsing from within. The lead had eaten its way through her blood, the corsets had reshaped her bones, and the years of sleepless vigilance had carved deep hollows beneath her eyes. Yet she refused to surrender the stage. To her, power was performance, and the audience was the world. Even when her hands shook so violently that she could not hold a pen steady, she demanded to sign every document herself, tracing her trembling name across decrees that her council had already decided. Even when her teeth were gone and she could no longer chew, she stuffed her cheeks with cloth to preserve the illusion of youth. Even when her hair had fallen away, she wore wigs so heavy that her neck ached beneath the jeweled weight. She was no longer ruling England, she was preserving a myth. Her courtiers knew it, though none dared say so aloud. They saw the way she stared into space during council meetings, the way her mind wandered in mid-sentence as if chasing memories she could no longer hold. They smelled the sickness clinging to her clothes, the sweet, corrupt odor that even the strongest perfumes could not disguise. They knew something was dying inside her, perhaps her liver, perhaps her sanity, but the greater fear was that England itself might die with her. For she had never named an heir, never written down the one decision that could ensure the survival of her realm. To declare a successor was to invite plots, assassins, and war. To keep it secret was to let the kingdom teeter on the edge of chaos. And so she did what she had always done. She said nothing. Silence was her last weapon. In the winter of 1603, the silence deepened into something darker. She stopped eating. The swelling in her belly made her appear grotesquely pregnant, a cruel irony for a queen who had lived and died as the Virgin. Her throat burned too fiercely to swallow. Her voice cracked into whispers that no one could understand. When the physicians begged her to rest, she refused. When her ladies pleaded for her to lie in bed, she only shook her head. She spent her final weeks upright in a chair, surrounded by cushions, as if defying gravity itself. Sleep was the one enemy she could not charm, could not outwit, and she feared that lying down meant surrendering to death. The candles burned low as she stared into the corners of her room, speaking to figures that no one else could see. Sometimes she laughed softly, sometimes she cried, sometimes she reached out her hand to empty air and whispered her mother's name. The courtiers outside her door heard everything and said nothing. When the end finally came, it was not glorious. There were no last proclamations, no grand speeches of divine purpose. On the night of March 23rd, she gave a faint nod at the mention of James of Scotland, the son of the woman she had executed decades earlier, and then she collapsed into stillness. The next morning, her attendants found her motionless, her eyes open but unseeing. The Virgin Queen was dead. What followed was not mourning but containment. The room was sealed, guards posted, curtains drawn. Only her most trusted ladies remained to prepare her body. And when they began to undress her, the legend came apart piece by piece. The makeup peeled away in gray sheets, revealing the ruin beneath, the blackened flesh, the sunken jaw, the sores that oozed through layers of cloth. The corset that had shaped her figure was pried loose, leaving deep grooves that cut into her ribs like scars of iron. The air filled with the scent of decay so powerful that one maid fainted before they finished. What lay before them was not Gloriana the Divine, but a broken body twisted by decades of poison and pride. By dawn, the coffin was sealed in lead. The tomb was locked before rigor mortis had even stiffened her limbs. The orders were clear: no examination, no exposure, no truth. The legend of the Virgin Queen would live eternal, but her body, the evidence of what the legend had cost, was to be hidden forever. For 6 centuries, every request to open her tomb has been denied. Historians have examined kings, warriors, martyrs, but not her. Because the truth buried beneath that stone would shatter an empire's most sacred image. It would reveal that the woman who ruled the seas, who defied popes and crushed armadas, had been slowly murdered by the mirror that made her immortal. The Virgin Queen never married, not because she would not, but because she could not. Her body was her curse, her beauty, her weapon, her crown, her punishment. And so the greatest monarch England ever knew lies beneath Westminster Abbey, sealed in silence, her secret intact. The nation built an empire on her image, a goddess carved from suffering and lead. But peel back the paint, and the truth is sickening. England's golden age was written in a woman's slow death. 600 years later, her coffin remains closed, not to honor her, but to protect the lie she became. The Virgin Queen may be dead, but the myth, like the poison, still lingers in England's blood. If you've watched until the end, remember, history hides its darkest truths behind crowns and candles. Like the video, share the story, and subscribe, because some secrets are too powerful to stay buried forever.